In the years leading up to the Great Depression, the United States Supreme Court frequently struck down state economic regulations as contradictory to the guarantees of substantive due process. The era became known for its most famous case, Lochner versus New York, in which the court invalidated a state law establishing maximum work hours. In the Lochner-era case of Adkins versus Children's Hospital of the District of Columbia, the Supreme Court considered the constitutionality of a law setting a minimum wage for women. Congress enacted a minimum wage law for women and children in the District of Columbia in 1918. Congress's purpose in enacting the law was to protect female workers' health and morals. Two parties challenged the law, suing Adkins and the rest of the Minimum Wage Board responsible for administering the program. One was Children's Hospital of the District of Columbia, which employed many women. The other was a woman who'd lost her job when her employer couldn't pay the minimum wage. The trial court dismissed both challenges. The appellate court initially affirmed the trial court but reversed on rehearing. The United States Supreme Court granted cert to determine whether a law establishing a minimum wage for women unconstitutionally interfered with the freedom of contract guaranteed by the Fifth Amendment's Due Process Clause. Justice Sutherland, writing for a 5-justice majority, concluded that the law was unconstitutional. The court held that Congress's attempt to set a minimum wage for women and children violated the freedom of contract protected by the Constitution. Although freedom of contract wasn't absolute, only exceptional circumstances could justify an exercise of legislative authority to curb it. The majority observed that earlier decisions upheld laws restraining the right to contract involving businesses that served some public interest, regulations about the method and time of payment, or caps on hours worked. The minimum wage law, Sutherland explained, was none of these things. The law regulated the amount of wages, which was the heart of the contract. None of the laws that had been previously upheld applied to all workers regardless of their field. No connection existed between the minimum wage, the employer's business, or the employee's work. This restriction on the freedom of contract was, therefore, arbitrary and lacked any reasonable basis. The basis for the minimum wage wasn't the value of the work performed. Instead, the law was meant to ensure female employees good health and morals. But there was no evidence that the minimum wage improved women's conditions. As a naked, arbitrary exercise of power, the law couldn't stand. The majority distinguished the court's 1908 decision in Muller v. Oregon, which had upheld a law setting the maximum number of hours for female workers in certain industries. The Muller court had reasoned that differences between the sexes justified a different rule for female workers. However, in the Adkins court's view, revolutionary changes to the status of women in society since 1908, including the adoption of the 19th Amendment, which guaranteed women the right to vote, had all but eliminated those differences. Chief Justice Taft, joined by Justice Sanford, dissented. Legislatures limited freedom of contract on the assumption that employees and employers didn't have equal bargaining power. Taft didn't see a distinction between a law setting a maximum number of hours, which the court had upheld in Muller, and a minimum wage. The 19th Amendment didn't alter the physical differences between the sexes, the concern underlying the statute in Muller and the statute here. Justice Holmes also dissented, observing that the law regularly interferes with what men want to do, including create contracts. The minimum wage law resembled hundreds of exercises of the police power that had withstood constitutional challenge. The Supreme Court overruled Adkins in 1937 in West Coast Hotel v. Parrish. There, the court concluded that minimum wage requirements didn't violate the 14th Amendment's Due Process Clause, so long as the requirements were reasonably related to a proper legislative purpose and weren't arbitrary or discriminatory. Parrish, in turn, represented the end of Lochner-era constitutional protection for economic liberty and paved the way for Depression-era New Deal legislation.